Thanks.
Finally, good.
Thanks, Dick. Brad's asked me to keep the introduction brief, and that's pretty good. I'm going to let him speak for himself. Well, he can say that he's a comedy scriptwriter, has written for dozens of famous comedians, but let's let him tell you all about it. So it's over to you, Brad.
Okay, if you're all still awake. My name, as you heard, is Brad Ashton. If you're expecting Brad Pitt, you've been conned. But I've worked for 55 years for lots of top comedians in England. I hope folks that you know most of them. If you don't, well, I'm sorry. The stories themselves hopefully will get us through those. Um, the Before I start though, let's get the commercial over with. Okay, I've written 4 books on comedy so far. The first one was called How to Write Comedy. Second one was called The Funny Thing About Writing Comedy. The third one was called The Job of a Lifetime. And the fourth one, which is the one I particularly want to show you, is, as you can see the title there, Stand Up and Be Laughed At. Now, I'm not showing you this book because I want you to go out and buy a copy. You buy as many as you want, okay? But it's the back I want to show you because it says that the foreword was written by Ken Dodd. Now, I don't know whether you know Ken Dodd in Canada at all, but Ken Dodd was one of our top comedians, and he was the most sought after comedian in the whole country, mostly by the tax people, because he was actually done for £1 million tax evasion. He said it was my own fault. He said when I joined the profession, income tax was a shilling in the pound. I thought it still was. But he after the court case, he actually capitalised on it because he used to introduce himself as I'm Ken Dodd, comedian, raconteur, and failed accountant. But what I thought was funny though, and again, I don't know whether you know this guy, but he took advice before the court case from Lester Piggott. Now, Lester Piggott is one of our top jockeys, and Lester Piggott was done for £3 million tax evasion and actually spent a year in prison for it. But he did give Ken Dodd some very good advice. He said the first thing you do is you go to your doctor and ask for a certificate to say you've got a bad heart. Because once you've got that, if they do put you in prison, you'll be in the hospital wing where you won't have to mix with the other convicts. The second bit of advice he gave him was insist that the court case be held in your own hometown, Liverpool, where everybody knows you and loves you, and with a bit of luck, you can bribe the jury. Which is probably what he did, because he got away with it. But why I thought it was funny that he took advice from Lester Piggott was, as I just said, Lester Piggott was done for £3 million. And when he realised the tax people were onto him, he said, I hold up my hand, I admit I owe you £3 million. And I'll write you out a check for it right now, which he did on an account they didn't even know about. It's true. Ken Dodd, say we're a great comedian, one of our greatest, but he had one word missing from his vocabulary, and that word was goodbye. Because once he had the audience in the palm of his hand, he could not let go. He'd go on and on and on. And I went to see him once in a show in Bournemouth, in which we should have finished at 10:30. It finished at 1. He just went on and on and on. And one of the funniest lines I've heard came from a comedian, Bernie Clifton, who said of Ken Dodd just before the court case, if Ken gets 2 years, he'll do 4. Actually true. I don't know whether you know Les Dawson, I did several series with, marvelous comedian, a lovely, lovely man. But his act was playing, as well as doing jokes, playing the piano badly. And he said he learned that while entertaining in a brothel in Paris, and his mind wasn't fully on what he was doing. Which, I mean, it's not actually, because the truth of the matter is that if you do play a published tune that's in copyright, in other words, within 70 years of it being published, and you have to pay to hear played or sung, whatever it may be, then you've got to pay a royalty to the Performing Rights Society. However, if you change every fourth note, you don't have to, which is why every fourth note he played was a bum note and saved himself a fortune. That was Les Dawson. But if as a comedy writer, you're writing for a comedian that has a definite persona, then you're halfway home because the audience know what they're thinking, and all you've got to do is put words in their mouth or put them in an alien situation so you get laughs. Let's take, for instance, Tommy Cooper. Do you know Tommy Cooper in Canada? You know, Tommy Cooper was, again, one of our top comedians, and his persona was that he was an idiot. And it worked extremely well because Tommy Cooper was an idiot. And I realized that one day. He said to me, Brad, he said, you're Jewish. He said, a friend of mine's son is getting bar mitzvah, and they expect me to go along to the synagogue, and they think I'm going to say something funny. He said, well, can you give me something funny I can say? I said, well, when we Jews go to the synagogue, when Jewish men, we wear a skull cap, which is called a couple, Kupel, couple. So you went along to the synagogue, and the man outside said, any man that comes in here has to have a couple. So when I had the couple, time I came back, it was all finished. He said, God love. He said, but I didn't understand it. He hadn't got much up here. What he had got up there was a reputation for being the stingiest man in England. And there's a joke they tell about Tommy Cooper, which is, I'm sure, based on truth, where he had a taxi ride. And at the end of the ride, he said to the driver, he paid the driver, he said, look, have a drink on me. And he put something in his top pocket, which was a tea bag. It's true. With Tommy, I was actually in the audience the night he died. He died in the middle of a TV show. And I was there because I was writing the continuity for the show for a comedian called Jimmy Tarbuck, who was a compere. And I don't know whether any of you ever saw the show, but Tommy was not, though he had been always topping the bill, in that particular show, he was halfway down the bill, and the bill was topped by Howard Keel, American singer Howard Keel. And I had written a whole page of banter between Jimmy Tarbuck, the compere, and Howard Keel to be done just before Howard Keel's first number. And it had about 8 possible laughs in it. Now, when you're writing for Americans, I don't know whether this applies to Canadians as well, but when you're writing for Americans, the comedians, they never say, oh, that's a funny joke, or what's a funny scene. They say, that's a cute joke, or well, I like that scene, that's cute. They use the word cute a lot. And I wasn't there for the rehearsal for the show, but when I got back just before the show, I saw in a copy of Howard Keel's script, he had the word cute against each of the funny lines. And I was very happy about that, except on the show, it wasn't in at all. And after the show, I said to the producer, what happened? He said, well, Howard Keel refused to do it. I said, why? He said, well, he's in his dressing room, ask him. I said, Howard, what happened? He said, well, first of all, he said, I'm a singer, not a comedian. And secondly, I didn't like the routine at all. I said, but against each of the funny lines, you put the word cute. He said, no, you misread my handwriting. It was cut. The first time I saw Tommy Cooper actually was in a summer season show in Blackpool. And he was doing a very, very funny sketch, Send Up of Candid Camera. And it was fronted by a guy called Jeremy Hawke, who said to the audience, ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce our next victim, I'm going to play a practical joke on him. I'm going to swallow these 2 cloves of garlic, and everything I say to him is going to begin with an H. How are you today? How are things? And that was the whole basis of the sketch. Every time he said something, Tommy would flinch, which was the best way to write for Tommy Cooper because he couldn't remember lines very well. Give other people the lines, let him do the reacting. And it was a very funny sketch. After the show, I went backstage to speak to him. I said, Tommy, where did you get that sketch from? He said, oh, I wrote it myself. I said, well, fantastic. I said, well, you write stuff like that, you really don't need writers. Many years later, I was actually writing his TV series for Thames Television, and we had a 2-week break in the middle. And I went to New York on holiday, and there I was watching television, and they were replaying the old Ed Sullivan shows from 1962. And Tommy Cooper had been in one of them. And also in that show was Mickey Rooney. And what was Mickey Rooney doing? That Candid Camera sketch. And so I managed to get hold of a copy of the show on tape. And when I got back, it was Tommy's birthday. I said, Tommy, I got a present for you. And I gave him the tape. He said, what's on it? I said, well, you play it tonight when you get home. And that night he phoned me up. He said, you bastard, where'd you get that from? I said, the same place as you did, you liar. That was Tommy Cooper. But actually, Tommy Cooper was a bit of a cheat. I'll explain that in a minute. What happened was that he always turned. He was a big drinker. In fact, 6 weeks every year he went to dry out in a spa. But he used to turn up at night. I was always late, and while he was in his dressing room, putting on his tuxedo, he wore a throat mic, and he sent his son up on stage, go behind the curtain with a walking stick and keep banging the curtain. And Tommy's voice over the throat mic would say, "There must be an opening to this curtain somewhere. I'll find the opening to this curtain somewhere." The audience, thinking he was behind the stage, were laughing their heads off, and he wasn't even there. And then finally, when he was dressed, he'd open the curtain and say, "Well, thank God you're still here." And so say he was getting laughs without even being there. But there was one comedian that went even further than that. I'll give you a hint. This comedian for 10 years did 39 one-hour-long shows for Thames Television in England. I think they were shown in Canada. And they were shown actually to 120 countries around the world. The revenue from that alone kept Thames Television going for 10 years. Who you think? Who am I talking about? I'm talking about Benny Hill.
Benny Hill. Yeah.
Benny Hill. Benny Hill, he kept that series going for 10 years till he got so fat, it looked ridiculous him chasing the girls, because if they caught them, he couldn't have done anything anyway. But Benny was, everything in those Benny Hill shows, those 39 shows, everything he did got a huge laugh. Every gag, every situation, every visual part of the scene, everything got a big laugh. It couldn't fail. And you know why? Because every laugh came out of a can. Benny could not face a real live audience. He brilliantly acted as if he were reacting to an audience that was there that was not there at all. Brilliant comedian. And when he died, I mean, very successful. When he died 18 years ago, he left £10 million in his bank account. And when they cleared out his flat, they found another 4 million under cushions in teapots and all over the show. But when he actually was switched from the BBC to Thames Television, at that time I was writing with an American writer called Dick Vosborough. We were partners for about 6.5 years. And Benny phoned us up one day. He said, "Dick, Brad, will you come to my flat tonight? I'll cook you a meal and we'll talk about you writing for me." And we turned up, and when he opened the door, he was wearing a pink frilly apron. And Dick Vosborough said, "Benny, you make someone a lovely wife." And he got very offended. He spent the whole evening telling us how he picked up girls at Hammersmith Palais, because we never knew his real sexuality. Not that it made any difference in those days. Today, it does make a difference, because I counted yesterday on the BBC, there are 13 BBC shows fronted by gay people. It's got to the point in the BBC now, if you want to get in, you've got to come out. Typical BBC. And at that time also, I was writing for another great comedian. I'm talking about when commercial television first started in England. It was in August 1955. And Dick Vosborough and I were hired to write the very first comedy series. It was a series called Here We Go. It starred June Whitfield, Billy Dainty, and Bruce Forsyth. Now, I don't know whether you know Bruce Forsyth in Canada, but again, a huge success, big comedian in England. And so I'd known Bruce for over 60 years. I'd known his jokes a lot longer. Many years after that series, he wound up doing our series in England called Strictly Come Dancing. And he was getting on a bit in years, and his eyesight had gone. He couldn't read the cue cards. He was well past his sell-by date. On the series, I don't know whether you have the series in Canada or not, but on the series, the rule is that you had to lose one person every week. And for my money, he's the one they should have lost. It wasn't his fault. Age had caught up with him. I mean, when he died, they said he was 89, but nobody was sure. They were still carbon dating his birth certificate. Now, see, he'd been in the business a long time. He started out doing the Empire circuit, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Greek Empire. But when he died, he said, he hadn't got an enemy in the world, and it's just true. He'd outlived a lot of them. But I mean, to be serious, I actually went along to one of his birthday parties, and there were 79 candles on the slice that I had. But Bob Monkhouse, another of our great comedians, Bob Monkhouse, wrote a marvelous book called Over the Limit. And in this book, he spent a whole chapter talking about Bruce Forsyth. And he said Bruce Forsyth was the greatest comedian in the world, if you believe what Bruce Forsyth says. And when Bruce Forsyth came out of Strictly Come Dancing after 10 years, he went to live in Puerto Rico, where his wife comes from. And the BBC wanted to come back to London to do one episode of a series called Have I Got News for You, which he did. It was very, very good. And they phoned him up and said, would you come back and do it? And he said, well, if you send a plane to pick me up. They said, sure, no worry. And they sent a plane to pick him up. And on the day, it was bad weather and the plane was delayed. And at the BBC, they're very worried. Will he arrive in time? Will he arrive in time? And then they were relieved to get a call from the airport to say the Ego has landed. What else can we talk about? Do you know John Cleese, for instance? You know John Cleese in Canada? You do? Okay. You've obviously seen 40 Stars. I assume you had the series over there. I never worked with John Cleese. In fact, I say I never met him. I actually sat right next to him for a whole day at a writing seminar, but I didn't want to talk to him because I didn't want to intrude in his privacy, and he obviously didn't know who I was. But I was sorry about that because 3 weeks after that, the Variety Club of Great Britain decided to give him an award as the best comedy performer of the year. And he refused to go along to the ceremony. He said, I'll accept the award and make my speech sitting at my desk at my flat back at home. And he did. And sitting right in front of him on the desk, right in front of the camera, was my first book, How to Write Comedy. So, and it sold 300 copies the following day. So I assume that, in fact, that he read the book. I say I assume because, I mean, I've written 5 books now, Dalek's Annual and these 4 comedy books, and my wife's never read any of them. And worse than that, 3 months ago, I sent my latest book up to my son who lives in Yorkshire. And yesterday he phoned me up. He said, Dad, I finally got round to reading your book. I'm in the loo. He said, right now, page 1 is in front of me. In a minute, it'll be behind me. So you can't, that's super weird. But well, on the subject of books as well, incidentally, yeah, I don't know whether you've seen this book, Homebrew. It's the autobiography of your comedian, Drew Carey. And on page 28 of it, if I may just put my glasses on, second, I'll just read you what it says. It says, he said that before I started doing stand-up, I never really held any job for over a year. So here I was, without a job again, and with this friend of mine made me an offer. He was a disc jockey at the Connecticut radio station, and he thought I was so funny. So he said if I ever thought of any jokes for his morning radio show, he'd pay me, like, 10 or 20 bucks, something like that. And I thought, well, I can make a living, $100 a week out of this way. So so I went to the downtown Cleveland library and checked out a book on how to write jokes. It was called How to Write Comedy by Brad Ashton. I pored over that book, taking notes and practically memorizing it, and taught myself how to write jokes. So I obviously had an influence on Drew Carey. But since John Cleese had my book in front of him, I assume I had an influence on his writing, which was strange, very strange. Because if you've seen the series, or 40 Towers, it goes against what we're all taught as writers, that if you're writing a situation comedy, your main character has got to be someone that's likable, someone with whom you have empathy and sympathy. And the main character he created was Basil Fawlty, an out-and-out swine. Was nasty to everybody, rude to everybody. But it worked because of one simple little thing they added in at the last minute, that he was afraid of his wife. And that's what gave him the vulnerability to make the character work. And his actual wife see, they only ever did 12 episodes. The reason was he wrote the first 6 with his first wife, Connie Booth, who was in the series playing the hotel maid. the BBC liked it and commissioned the second series, which got very good figures. Then they commissioned the third series of 6 shows, but by that time, John Cleese had got divorced from Connie Booth, with whom he wrote the shows, and she refused to write any more with him. So there was never more than 12 episodes. I actually went along to a talk that John Cleese gave at the British Film Institute, and it was the year he made a film called A Fish Called Wanda. And he told us that as he wrote the film and starred in it, he made that year £52 million. And the same year he sold a company he owned called Video Arts, which made TV commercials. He sold that for 30 million. So that year alone, he made £82 million. And today he's flat broke because of all the money he has to pay to his ex-wives. Because as I told you, his first wife was Connie Booth, and then the other three wives were also American ladies. He actually married 4 American ladies, and each one he married in their own hometown in America. And one day they asked him, when you married your third wife, what state were you in? He said, temporary insanity. And he said, when you told her you were divorcing her, how did she take it? He said, in cash. But John Cleese today is a very, very angry man. A very angry man because the BBC have told him they're never, ever going to repeat the Monty Python shows again. Because they said comedy's changed. It's all completely different now. And that's true. It's true. I mean, because people often say to me, what do you think of the modern comedians? And my answer is, I try not to think of the modern comedians. I mean, in England, there's only about 3 that I like. I like Jack D. I like Frank Skinner. I like Peter Kay. I used to like comedian Lee Evans, which is very sad because comedian Lee Evans has decided to retire. And what's even more sad is that Russell Brand hasn't decided to retire. I can't stand him and his cohort, Jonathan Ross. I still think they shot the wrong JR. But the good thing, though, about the Jonathan Ross show is that it goes out on Saturday night, because that's the night I go out. Okay. Who else can we talk? I'm just been trying to find people that you know that I know, because the most important thing that a comedian must have is timing. And for me, the master of all was definitely Jack Benny. Jack Benny came to England in 1964 and did one show for the BBC. And it was produced by Ernest Maxon, who was a friend of mine, who told me the story. He said he phoned Jack Benny up, who was staying at the Dorchester in London at the time. He said, Jack, he said, they've just delivered the first part of the script. When do I get the rest? And Jack said, no, you've got the whole script there. I said, Jack, he said, I just told you it's 17 minutes and it's an hour-long show. Jack Benny said, yeah, but that's the whole script. So look, Jack, he said, I've been in the business 20 years. I can time the script. The most this can run for is 20 minutes. And Jack said, Ernest, I promise you that's a whole script. And it was. Because what he did, he said, what happens is when the audience stopped laughing, I turn my head. And when I turn back again, they start laughing again. And he made that 17-minute script last a complete hour. Fantastic timing. But if you're writing for someone like Jack Benny, as a writer, it's an easy task because he had 4 things going for him. I don't know whether you remember his shows, which they're repeating all the time on American television, but he had 4 things going for him. 1, he never admitted to being older than 39. 2, that he played the violin badly. Actually, he was a virtuoso because you've got to be that good to play that bad. 3rd thing was he pretended to have a toupee. He jokes about toupee, which he never really had. The 4th thing was his stinginess. And I'm sure you all know the joke where he was walking along the street and he was approached by a mugger who said, money or your life? I said, money or your life? And Jack said, I'm still thinking about it. That was typical Jack Benny. But taking that one gimmick of stinginess, my favourite show of his was where Rochester, his manservant, comes into the room and said, Mr. Benny, there's something different about the curtains. You've changed the curtains. And Jack Benny said, yeah, Rochester, had those same curtains for 30 years. I got fed up and I got new curtains. Rochester said, looks nice. So, Rochester, now you're here, let's sit down and eat. And the tablecloth is made out of the old curtains. The napkins made out the old curtains. When he sneezes, handkerchiefs made out the old curtains. All the way through the show, everything's made out the old curtains. And finally, when he goes to bed, he drops his trousers and his shorts made out the old curtains. So they got the gimmick out of those one things going all the way along the line. So it's so simple if you've got someone that's got that kind of a reputation. Who else can we talk about? Because one of the I don't know. Do you know Morecambe and Wise in Canada? You know the couple Morecambe and Wise double act? No. Well, they stole the half of Jack Benny's gimmicks. I'm just trying to desperate to find someone here that you would know the same as I do. Did you watch Till Death Us Do Part? Is that on in Canadian television? With starring Warren Mitchell. No. All in the Family was a spin-off from it. No. Well, I'll tell you what. Rather than carry on at this stage, the only I'll talk about, for instance, Tony Hancock. I'm sure you know Tony Hancock. Tony Hancock was one of our top British comedians, and he got one of the easiest laughs I've ever seen on British television because of his persona as a cynic. And on this show, he was on a cruise and walking along the deck, and further along the deck with the captain and the head chef. And the captain says to the head chef, "I'm fed up with these same vegetables every day. Haven't you got anything different?" And Hancock walks by just in time to hear the head chef say, "I'm sure we got some leaks downstairs." It writes itself. It causes a whole mutiny because of his being a cynic. I'm going to pack up at this point talking to you because I'm lost for who you know and I don't know. So what I'm going to suggest is that from this point onwards, I throw it open to questions so that we can then talk on the same ground, as it were. So are there any questions you want to ask me? Unmute yourself and please go ahead.
Brad, what you're saying about Benny Hill, he never did any in-person appearances, it was all canned?
Not once he did television, he never did any live personal appearances ever.
Did he do any stage shows?
The reason he said his answer was that he didn't trust the props at all. He said that I do a lot of visuals with props in the sketches, and I don't trust the props. They always go wrong, so I best do it without an audience. And he did. And so he'd do sometimes 3 or 4 takes. If everything went wrong, he didn't worry about an audience being there. It's the same with Tommy Cooper that I mentioned before. Tommy Cooper, when I did the series for him for Thames Television, we did 3 series, and he refused to ever use any of the props that we supplied from Thames Television. He said, "I don't trust them." And he insisted that every prop we used came from a magic shop in Wandsworth in South London. And we found out why later. The shop was owned by his brother, which he had half share in. Who can we talk about? You know, Max Miller, Dick Emery, Norman Wisdom.
Norman Wisdom, yeah.
I'd be interested.
Norman Wisdom disappeared from our screens for 7 years. And we all thought that he'd either died or retired. But far from that, because Tony Newley wrote a musical called The Smell of the Grease Paint, The Roar of the Crowd.
Yeah.
And it opened in Manchester, in London. Not London, but Manchester, in England. For some reason, and I'll never know why, it never actually came to London. But it opened in Manchester with Tony Newley starring in it. And it was a big success. And Henry Sharrock of Broadway in New York heard about it, went into Manchester, saw the show, loved it, and said he wanted to take it back to New York, and which he did to Broadway. But unfortunately, Tony Newley had signed to do a TV series and couldn't leave the country. So they had to find someone to play the part, and they found someone that could sing and dance. Norman Wisdom. And Norman was opened on Broadway in that show for a whole year. And then he toured America with the show. And then when he finished that, he went into another Broadway musical called Vaudeville. Toured that for a year. So that was a year on Broadway, a year touring. Then he went to yet another Broadway musical called Walking Happy, which had the best choreography, comedy choreography I've ever seen in a musical. He started in that for a year and then toured again. And then after 6 years, he got homesick. He came back to London and appeared in the children's variety performance in front of the Queen. And I was there for the rehearsal. And he came in ashen-faced, trembling. And we said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Well," he said, "nobody knows me. He said, I've been out of the country for 7 years. Nobody knows me. And they put me at the top of the bill. He said, I'm going to die a death. I'm going to get a certificate to say I can't do the show." And we insisted he go ahead. And he was a huge success because he had universal comedy. He had visual comedy, didn't rely on words at all, and was a big success. But it was nice to see a guy that humble. It was a big star. He later on in his life, the last few years of his life, he did what I've been doing of appearing on cruises. I've done 62 cruises so far. And what he used to do is he'd sit on stage with Patrick Dickinson, his old army buddy, beside him, and they'd field questions on bits of paper sent in by the audience. So they weren't really the same bits of paper. I mean, he obviously had set questions, so he had funny answers. That was he finished up the last 4 years of his life. That was no wisdom. Anyway, who else can we talk about?
Brad? I'm interested in your thoughts on Monty Python.
Monty Python.
I think that's the greatest comedy that's ever come out of the UK.
It was a cheat, in fact. I'll tell you what I mean by that. The hardest thing when you're writing a sketch is to think of a suitable ending to it. In fact, you really can't. I can't write a sketch until I've got the ending of it, and then you work backwards. They didn't bother. Halfway through, they say, "And now for something completely different," and avoid all that.
Indeed,
the Germans decided they wanted to have their own version of Monty Python, but they actually called over the complete Monty Python team to do 6 shows for German television. The only one on the team that actually spoke German was John Chapman. The rest, or was it Grant? Well, anyway, John Chapman. The rest of them did the German, but they did it parrot fashion. In other words, you could say the words, but there was no proper inflection in it. And it died. The show, in the end, after 6 shows, they just stopped the show and cannibalized it into 2 shows. But it was one terrible joke that John Cleese tells, where he said that when they got to Germany, he said the first thing they took, they put them in a taxi, the first thing they took them to was the Buchenwald concentration camp. He said, and they got there at 5 o'clock, and it was closed, and they wouldn't let them in. And John Cleese said, "Well, how can we get in?" Eric Idle said, "Tell them we're Jewish." Terrible joke. But that's Monty Python. It was a different kind of comedy. It was what they call university comedy. Prior to Monty Python, all comedians were sort of cockneys, came from working class backgrounds. And suddenly Monty Python had the university crowd doing what they called edgy comedy. And it worked for quite a while. And now, as I say, comedy's changed and they don't do that kind of thing anymore. We don't have any sketch shows anymore.
Brad, did you know any of the Carry On characters? Did James?
Yeah, I worked on 5 of those Carry On films.
Wow.
Because it was written originally. The first 8 were written by Norman Hudis, who'd been the publicity director for J. Arthur Rank Films, and he wrote the first 8. And there's a big difference between the first 8 and what followed. Because in those first 8, there wasn't any innuendos. It was all straight comedy. And then Talbot Rothwell took over, and they're all, for the next 29 of them altogether, they're all innuendos. But Peter Rogers, the producer of it, paid me £100 for 5 times working on 5 of those films to gag them up. And the ridiculous thing was, it was during the reign of Norman Hudis, who wrote those first 8. And I was working with Norman Hudis on another television series. And Norman was one of these guys where if you altered a comma, he'd sulk in the corner. So he'd come in and say, "Oh, Charles Hawtrey had a lovely gag, and yes, we did it while rehearsing Carry On." And he'd quote my own gag back to me, and I daren't tell him that I'd written it. So there are writers like that that think that everything I write is, has to be exactly as done. And I must have written at least 2,000 shows because I worked for 7 different countries. And no script has ever been done exactly as I first wrote it. That's what rehearsals are for. rehearsal before you change it until it fits. Do you remember a comedian on American television way back 1969, Dave King, English comedian? He did 21 shows,
Yeah, yeah.
replacement for Milton Berle. And they called him over to be a replacement for Milton Berle. I've been working on his English show. He's very, very good comedian, marvelous one. And so they was doing it in the 46th Street rehearsal room in New York. And I happened to be living in New York at the time. And I went along to rehearsal, and there were about 40 people there. And he'd taken his own 2 writers along to America with a Green Hills. And they said, oh, Dave won't stand for this. I said, what? I said, well, he won't stand for all these people hanging around while he's rehearsing. And the producer said, well, you've got to, because, you know, they're the sponsorship people. They're the people from the network. They're people who are paying for the show. And they always came along to Milton Berle's rehearsal because it was a stand-in for the replacement of Milton Berle show. And they said, well, wait and see what Dave thinks when he arrives. And Dave turned up and he asked who these people were, and he was told the same answer. He said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, either they go or I go. I said, well, you can't kick them out. You know, they're the people paying for the show. He said, well, I can't. He said, let me tell them then. He said, ladies and gentlemen, he said, I know that Milton Berle wanted you here for rehearsal. He likes to hear the laughs. But I work from a skeleton script. And in the 4 days rehearsal, that's when we actually built the show. You're welcome to come to the dress rehearsal in 4 days' time. But I will not rehearse in front of an audience. And they said, well, thank you very much indeed. One by one, they thanked him. So loads of work back in our office. You know, Mr. Berle insisted we be here, but we'd rather we were back here catching up with our work. And he was a huge success. Ran for 21 weeks. And I've got several TV times with his picture on the front. And at the end, they said to him, Nick Van Hoff, the producer, said, well, Dave, you've done a good show for us. We'll bring you back next year again for the same slot to stand in for Milton Berle. And he said, no way. He said, I've provided a good show for you. He said, I'm not going to be a replacement for anybody else. From now on, I want a definite show in the fall season. And he said, and if they don't give it to me, I'm going to get the next plane back to London. And there was a 10-second pause. And then Nick Van Hoff says, hang on a second, I'll get my secretary to call you a taxi for the airport. And true enough, 2 years later, I met Dave King. He was in a play in the West End of London, Teeth and Smiles it was called. I went backstage to say hello to him. He said, me and my big mouth. He said, I could have been the biggest star on American television, but I had to open my big mouth and it ruined my career. That was it. Do you know Dave Allen?
Yes,
You know Dave
recognize him.
Dave Allen, again, a fool. Dave Allen, a marvelous comedian, brilliant timing. Was able to do lots of jokes against the Pope because he was Catholic. He was able to do that. But when he left the BBC and went on to Thames Television for twice as much money, they wrote 6 shows for him, and he never did them. He couldn't get on with a producer, and he said to Thames Television, "I can't work with this producer." And they said, "Look, we decide who produces the show. You're signed to do the show. You'll do the show with this producer." And he refused, and he walked out in the show. In fact, right up until the time he died, he was still being sued for walking out in the show. But he went back to the BBC, and he did one of those shows that had been written for him as a sort of pilot. And in it, he used the F word 5 times. And the head of the Light Entertainment, the BBC, James Moyer, said, "You can't do that." He said, "This is the BBC, you can't swear." I'm going back a few years, right? This is the BBC, you can't swear. And Dave said, Dave dug his heels in. He said, "Well, look, unless you let me use the F word at least, because this is the way people talk," he said, "unless you let me use the F word at least 3 times per show, I won't do the series." And James Moore said, "All right, fine, you can go ahead, you can do the series, knowing full well they're pre-recorded with the scissors in But he said, I was there at the time, he said, "He'll never ever work for the BBC again while I'm here." And he never did. And I met him 4 years later in the one of the theatres, the West End Theatre in the Loo, not by appointment. I met him in the Loo, and he had hair down to his shoulders. I said, "Hello, Dave, what are you doing these days?" He said, "I've just done a pilot show for Central Television." This was in November. He said, "It goes out in January, and if it's a success, we'll do another 6 next year." They never even put it out. It's still in the archives. He swore so much in it, they couldn't edit it out. It never, ever hit the screen again. And that was the end of Dave King's Dave Allen's career. He killed himself stone dead with it. Anybody else you want to talk about? I worked with Groucho. Groucho Marx, I did 14 shows with Groucho Marx. I was his head writer. He came to London in 1965 and we did 14 shows called Groucho in Britain. And it was based on his American series, You Bet Your Life. So in that, he played the quizmaster and you had two contestants. And the setup was he would be behind the desk. The two contestants would be on high stools and the audience was they're facing the audience. And Groucho would be facing the two contestants. What the audience couldn't see was that he was looking over their shoulder at the wall behind them in which the script was being rolled off. Because though he's supposed to be the greatest ad-libber in the world, in fact, he always had 3 writers under contract. And in the contract, it said they must never tell people that they're actually writing for him. But anyway, I was head writer for the series, but part of my job also was to find contestants. And one of the contestants I found was a guy that was an insurance salesman. He insured people in show business. He insured Semprini, who was a big pianist, showed his fingers. He insured John Hanson, who was opposite his voice. He insured Lionel Blair's feet, a tap dancer. He insured, and then he also insured a girl called Sabrina. And Sabrina at that time was the big busted lady of the day. Her bust measurement was 40 inches, and he insured her bust. And the terms of the insurance were that if her bust measurement was 40 inches, if it went down to 38 or less for 3 months or more, she would get £2,600 an inch, which in those days was a lot of money. And the time they actually signed the contract, her bust measurement had gone up to 41. So she had an inch in hand. So I said to Groucho, do you know who Sabrina is? She said, no, who is she? I said, well, never mind, forget it. And I stayed up that night and wrote a routine about the guy with the insurance. And we were supposed to do the show 2 years later, and it wasn't in the show. And I said, what happened? They said, well, Groucho refused to do it. I said, why? He said, it's all about tits. I said, no, it's not. The humour was that we, the audience, know something that the guy up on screen doesn't know. That's where the humour comes from. He said, well, he's refused to do it. So I said to Groucho, look, Groucho, if you don't do this, I'm fed up. They told me you'd be a pain in the neck, but you're hurting all the way down now. I'm fed up with it. I'm quitting. If you don't do the routine, I'm quitting the show. He said, no one quits, Groucho. I fire people. I said, well, fire me, then they've got to pay me for the rest of the series. And we're shouting at each other. And there's now a crowd of about 30 people around there. He said, I'll tell you what, smartass. He said, I'll do the routine, but if one line in it doesn't get a laugh, you're fired. Okay? I said, yeah, providing if it all gets laughs, you double my salary from now on. It's like digging a knife in the guy. Anyway, I must say, to be fair to him, he did do the routine well, and it all did get laughs. It's going back to 1965. I can only remember a couple of gags in it where he says, I also insured Sabrina. And Grace said, well, I don't know Sabrina. Is she a big figure in show business? And I said, yeah, in some places. Said, what do you mean some places? You mean like Carlisle, Northumberland, Glasgow? The guy said, you're in the right direction, up north. And so it went on for about 3.5 minutes with the guy saying bus measurement went up. They can't, went up to an inch in hand. And had Groucho finish it by saying, well, it's the first thing that's gone up. They can't blame on Harold Wilson, who was the Prime Minister at the time. But Groucho couldn't stand with losing a battle. So for the next 3 weeks, every morning when he came out of a nightclub at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, he'd phone me up. And he'd say, you know everything. He said, I'm going to Woolworths tomorrow to buy some matches for my pipe. Should I buy Swan Vesta or Mike, mate? My mate, stupid question like that. for 3 weeks, so he forgot his revenge. But he did pay me, and every Saturday morning there was a check on my typewriter. And if you go to my local bank here in Southgate in London, it's still on the wall. The first check he gave me, the bank manager framed it, and it's still on the wall of the bank. That was Groucho. Anybody else you want me to particularly talk about? Do you know the name Arthur Askey? Arthur Askey.
Yes.
1953. Arthur Askey was the biggest comedian in England. He was only 5'1", but he was the biggest comedian in England. And he had a television series called Before Your Very Eyes, and he wanted to also do a radio series. So I got a call from the head of light entertainment of BBC Radio, Con Mahoney, his name was. He said, Brad, he said, Arthur wants to do a radio series and we'd like you to write the pilot. Well, I've only just joined the profession, only been here a year. And to me, this was a huge accolade. I said, sure, I'd love to do it. And I spent 10 days working on that script, honing it every day until I was happy with it. And then I sent it into Con Mahoney. Never heard a word for a month. I rang him up and said, Con, what happened? He said, I don't know. He said, I sent the script to Arthur. He phoned me up 10 minutes later. He said, Arthur Askey said, would you have lunch with him tomorrow? So there we were, me and Arthur Askey having lunch. And we're talking about the weather. And we're talking about politics. And we're talking about traffic. No mention of the script. I couldn't stand this. After 20 minutes, I said, Arthur, have you read the script? He said, yes, dear boy. I said, well, what did you think of it? He says, all right, as far as it goes. I said, what do you mean as far as it goes? He said, well, you haven't put my ad-libs in yet. And until then, I actually thought comedians ad-lib. I didn't realize it was our job as writers to make it look like they're ad-libbing. Because some of the shows, the comedians are marvelous ad-libbers are actually all written in the script, and it was for Groucho Marx. It has to be, because you have 4 cameras on a TV show, and the camera's got to be on the one that's either speaking or reacting. So you have to have it well rehearsed, but the artists make it look like they're ad-libbing because they're pretty good at it. Who else can we talk about?
Two Ronnies.
Two Ronnies.
Two Ronnies, good. Two Ronnies were a great double act, but different from other double acts. In the other double acts, you had a comedian and a straight man. The two Ronnies is a comedian and a comedy actor. Now, what's the difference between a comedy actor and a comedian? Well, Ronnie Corbett was a comedian. In other words, he could get laughs as himself, whereas Ronnie Barker had to go into character, like Dick Emery and Peter Sellers had to go into character to be funny. They weren't funny as themselves at all. But Ronnie Barker was a great comedy actor. He went into a series called Open All Hours, and whether he got that in Canada, in which he played the character with a stutter, which if anybody else had played it would have been bad taste. But he did brilliantly. But also, before he went into television, Ronnie Barker, he was in a very popular radio series called The Navy Larks. And in it, he played a character, Abel Seaman Goldstein. Also in the show was another actor called Michael Bates, playing Abel Seaman Bates, the only man they couldn't promote to master. You can find out for yourself. So that was Ronnie Barker and Ronnie Corbett. They're brilliant actors. But anyway, again, I'm still not know who else. Who
you had David Frost on your list there.
David Frost became known in 1962 when we had the series That Was the Week That Was. Yeah. Prior to that, he had been a researcher for Associated Rediffusion and a part-time comedian. And the BBC in 1962 wanted to do this satire series. They'd never done a satire series before. And they couldn't make up their mind who should front it. And it was between 2 people. It was between David Frost and another researcher called Brian Redhead. And 300 of us were invited along to BBC, and we had to watch a pilot show which they co-hosted. And we had to vote which one of them got the job. And 2/3 of the way through, certainly Brian Redhead was way ahead and would certainly have got the job. And then David Frost did his stage act, which we hadn't seen, in which he said to the audience, call out the name of any member of the current cabinet and any political question you like. And he did, and I promise you this, it was a pitch perfect impersonation of 5 members of the cabinet. And that's what got him the job. And I said to him many times afterwards, why don't you do that now? He said, people impersonate me, I don't have to impersonate other people. But at that time, I had the reputation, because I was doing a series of Tommy Trinder every week, I had the reputation of being the fastest gag writer in the country. And I got the job of writing gags for David Frost in between the sketches. And the system was, the show was done at 11 o'clock on Saturday night. And at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, I gather all the newspapers for the week, write down all the headlines. And my target was between 7 o'clock and 3 o'clock when I had to hand the script into BBC to do 33 gags, which I did for 28 weeks. I mean, they weren't all great gags. They weren't all belly laughs. I'm not that clever. But there were smiles, giggles, and a few belly laughs in. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I had taken to David Frost in his dressing room at the BBC, and he refused to read them. He said, Brad, you wrote them. You read them to me. And the ones that excite me enough are the ones I'll remember and do on tonight's show. And out of the 33 gags, he did an average of 15. Except that one week, and it was in all the papers, he was having an affair with Janet Scott, an actress called Janet Scott, Thora Heard's daughter. And I turned up at 3 o'clock in the dressing room, and he's got her against the wall in the dressing room. I said, sorry, David, I'll come back later. He said, no, come in, Brad, read your gags. And I found I was reading them faster and faster to keep time with him. And that night, he only did 5 gags. His mind wasn't fully on what he was doing. That was David Frost, who went on to do American television and became a lovely, lovely man. We all loved him. He died, unfortunately, doing on the Queen Elizabeth, doing what I do, doing lectures. And just before it went on, he collapsed in his dressing room and died. Anybody else that you know, you think I might know? Yeah.
Brad, how about Don French?
Don French. Yeah, Don French, together with a partner, were very absolutely fabulous. It was a very, very successful series. I didn't particularly like it because it wasn't based on truth. I like comedians that actually are true, not too much exaggerated characters. But they were very successful. And Dawn French is now in the papers regularly because she lost 7 stone and then put it back again. Then she got another 4 stone she lost, then put it back again. And she did this series, The Vicar of Dibley, which was very successful. It actually wasn't written for a woman. It was originally written for a man, and they couldn't find anybody cast in it, so she wound up with the part as a trial. And it did so well because it had a very good cast with her. It was very good, and it worked in the end very successful. Storm French and Sanders, Francis Sanders, 2 women, because there hadn't been really a double act with women for years. Okay, who else? Anybody?
Brad.
Yeah, I'm with you.
The chap who played in All Mothers Do Have Them, and he ended up singing
Michael
in the
Crawford.
Phantom. Well, that's right. Were you associated with him?
No, Michael Crawford. What happened with that? Some Mothers Do Have Them was that it was written by a guy called Stuart Allen, wrote the script, and he sent it to the BBC, and they said, well, 16 different comedian producers turned it down. They said, yeah, not like who believed this character? Finally, it was offered to Norman Wisdom, the part.
Oh.
And Norman Wisdom said no, because the very first show was set in a lavatory where he falls down in the whole. He said, no, lavatory was not me. And he turned it down. And it was on a producer's shelf for 2 solid years until this particular producer went along to see a play in the West End of London called No Sex Please, We're British, with Michael Crawford in it. And he said, that's it. That's the character. That's a believable character. And that's how he got the job for it. But Michael Crawford wrote at least half the stuff himself.
Oh.
But most of the visuals. And as you know, he did all the stunts himself.
And he ended up then on Broadway in Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah, what I could never understood. Yeah, he did it. What I could never understood was that he was marvelous in the film Hello, Dolly, and yet they never ever brought him back for another film. And then he got very ill, and the last thing I saw him in was a show in which he was. It made him look so fat. I think he was ashamed to be seen in the park because he wore a beard, moustache, and a big belly and thing. And he played. I can't remember the name of the film, the name of the show, but it's more or less finished now. He's a very good singer, but he's not well, and that was the reason his career really finished. I read his autobiography, which was not very well written at all, in which he came over too big-headed, but a good performer, a marvelous performer. I've never understood say why he never made more films. I couldn't understand why Perry Como only made 1 film, Frankie Lane only made 1 film. So many people only made. Why? You saw the film Educating Rita?
Yes.
I thought Julie Walters was marvelous in that, but never got back to being another film.
Yeah.
With they're difficult people to work with or not, I have no idea. That may be the reason. Anybody else? No, I'll tell you what. I started off before talking about comedy. So let me tell you a few jokes. At least perhaps that might help you to go and tell your friends the jokes. Right? Because
Sure.
very few people have a good memory for jokes. I'll tell you these jokes. No pencils and paper, right? See if you can remember them afterwards. First one is about 4 women and they're meeting every Monday night to play poker. And after 10 years, one of them said, look, I can't hold back any longer. I've got a confession to make. I'm a kleptomaniac. But don't worry, I wouldn't steal off any of you because we've been friends for 10 years. Second one said, all right, I'll make a confession as well. I'm an infomaniac. But don't worry, I wouldn't steal your husbands because we've been friends for all this time. Third one said, I could make a confession. I'm a lesbian. But if I fancy any of you, you'd have known by now. Now look at the fourth one. She said, all right, if you're all going to make confessions, I'll make a confession as well. I'm a terrible gossip. I can't stand here talking. Got some phone calls to make. All right, 4 men, same situation. 4 men meet every Monday night to play poker, but for 10 years, but they're playing for money. And they know the wives object. They tell the wives they're a Turkish bath because it's all one section, no way you can check. And after 10 years, one of them one night loses £8,000 and has a heart attack and dies on the spot. And someone's got to tell the wife. So they draw straws and poor little Cyril gets a short straw. He's got to go along and tell the wife. He knocks on the door. She answers, she says, yes, can I help you? He said, madam, said, you don't know me, but me, your husband, and 2 other friends of ours been playing poker every Monday night for money. So what's your, I thought it was a Turkish party. Exactly. All our wives thought that, but we were actually playing for money. And I have to tell you that because tonight your husband lost £8,000. He said he lost £8,000. He should drop dead. He said he did. Okay, let's a short one. This one is about a husband and wife been married 10 years and had 2 beautiful children, a lovely little boy and a lovely little girl. And then the wife got pregnant and the husband decided he would go along to the birth this time. And he did. And the wife gave birth to the ugliest baby you've ever seen. He said, what is this? We had 2 beautiful children. Now this ugly one. Have you been sleeping with another man? She said, no, not this time. One more, then I'm going to go make my cup of tea. This is a religious joke. It won't offend anybody, I promise. This is a religious joke. It's about a girl who came off a cruise. And she said to her parents, Mum, Dad, I got wonderful news. On the cruise, I met this wonderful boy, and we're madly in love, and we want to get married. They said, well, great, marvelous. What's his name? She said, Izzy Levy. She said, you mean he's Jewish? Yeah, we can't marry him. What, just because he's Jewish? You can't marry a Jew, you can't marry a Muslim, you can't marry a Hindu. You're a Catholic girl, and we'll only agree to you marrying a Catholic boy. She said, but we're madly in love. We don't care. We'll only agree to you marrying a Catholic boy. Sure, what can I do? Sure. See if you can talk him into becoming a Catholic. I said, well, I'll try. And 2 weeks later, she came back. She said, Mum, Dad, great news. I worked hard on him and he's agreed to become a Catholic. I said, great, marvelous. In that case, we'll prepare the wedding. And they do. And a week before the wedding, she came in crying her eyes out. Mum, Dad, the wedding's off. Why? Religious grounds. What do you mean religious grounds? I thought you said you worked hard on him to become a Catholic. So I worked too hard. Now he wants to be a priest. All right.
Okay.
I should have done more homework and realised which could be, because my apart from Drew Carey, I did a series for Alan Young, who's Canadian. The Grantham Institute of Technology in Toronto ran my book out as a correspondence course. I had 2 weeks in the Upper Canada Village shooting a German TV series, which I thought was fascinating because it was in June, something we hadn't banked on. It's a German comedian starring in it, Peter Krause, good-looking guy. But every day, because in June you had these mosquitoes,
Yeah.
and every day more and more bumps on his face. We had to cover the mosquito bites. And I also did a series out at KJOH in Kingston about confidence tricks. That's my other subject. So I can't remember the name of the guy to start. Anyway, yeah. So I had some certainly connections with Canada, which I dearly loved, and hopefully one day I'll still come over there. But as it is, I'm 90 years old, which is true. People don't believe it. When I tell people I'm 90 years old, they look at me and they don't believe it. They think I'm much older, especially when they hear my jokes. Even I find it hard to believe I'm 90 because Petula Clark was born the same year as I was, and she's only 79. Anyway, thanks for being a good audience, and I hope we'll meet again sometime. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, man. I've got to leave though. They told me a kid of 5 can work this computer, and I can't find it.
Well, Doug will say a few words first. Doug?
Okay, you go ahead.
Well, Brad, I started off, and I got to confess from a personal standpoint, there's quite a few comedians that I personally didn't know. However, I got to admit, your insight and knowledge made both I did know and those I didn't know certainly come alive. Some favorably, others not so much, but that's the way it goes. Anyway, to say your presentation has been enlightening would be certainly an understatement. And I really enjoyed the humor that you brought to it. You've had an incredible career, and my God, and I just want to thank you for sharing the parts of it that you have with us. And thanks so much. I was enthralled the whole time, and I'm sure many others were. So thanks so much, Brad. That was great. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.